Hello, everyone. Good morning and welcome to our webinar, Medium Density Housing, What Does Good Look Like and How Do We Make It Affordable? I'm Allison Stewart and I'm the Deputy Chief Executive Officer of Infrastructure Victoria, and I really appreciate the time that you're taking to spend with us this morning. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that I am coming to you from the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. I would like to offer my respects to their elders past and present and extend that respect to the traditional lands that each of you are joining us from today. Today, I have the privilege of hosting an esteemed panel to discuss an issue of vital importance for the future of Melbourne. Infrastructure Victoria is the state government's advisory body on all matters related to infrastructure. We cover all sectors, including housing, and we make sure that we cover all areas of interest to Victoria. We've released several reports recently relating to the topic of housing, and we want to make sure that the state government, and as a state government's advisor, thinks through how to get better use of the state's existing infrastructure and how we can improve the lives of all Victorians through longer-term integrated land use and infrastructure planning. We've released several reports in the last couple of years that have focused on various different elements of housing and of density itself and how we really get the best overall for the future of Victoria. Our report, titled Our Home Choices, which was released at the beginning of last year, looked at how to shift housing demand from new suburbs to give more Victorians the choice to live close to jobs and services in our major cities. We examined why people are choosing homes in growth areas and the benefits of living in established suburbs closer to jobs, schools, and hospitals, and to public transport, using a survey of more than 6,000 people. That's available on our website, as are all of our reports. We then published a further report at the end of last year on Choosing Victoria's Future, which really considered how different city shapes and growth patterns impact the state's economy, our environment, and the quality of life for Victorians. This provided further evidence for why we need to help more people to live in the established parts of our biggest cities rather than continuing to sprawl. We also completed some previous work a couple of years ago called Density Done Well, which was a result of a community panel. And that panel was presented with various pieces of evidence and asked, what is it that would make density reasonable within the Melbourne context? And that showed that Melburnians of all ages and backgrounds will embrace greater urban density if there is good access to public transport, quality urban design, and green open space. So with that as a background context, I'm very pleased to introduce my fellow panelists today. We've got a mix of perspectives with planning, design, and building experts. As we go through the discussion today, if you have any specific questions for our panelists or for our panel in general, you'll be able to put the questions in the Slido. That box is available at the bottom of your screens where you're watching the webinar, and it says Q&A. And our team will make sure to pass those questions through, and we'll try to get to as many of them as possible. If you also want to view the webinar with captions, you can do so there's a link just below the presentation that you'll be watching right now. So introducing my fellow panelists today, first up we have Pat Fensham, who's the president of the Victorian division of the Planning Institute Australia. Welcome, Pat.
Thank you.
Pat is an urban planner who's lived and worked throughout Australia and internationally. He has expertise in many areas, including metropolitan and strategic planning, housing policy and research development, infrastructure planning and analysis, and regional economic development. So a really great person to have on the panel today. He also has a role at SGS, but today he's joining us in his capacity at PIA. Second up, we've got Michaela, who is the CEO of Master Builders Association of Victoria. Michaela was previously is a director on the Incolink board and also plays a vital role within the Building Industry Consultative Council. She has a unique blend of strategic acumen and industry insight and leaves an indelible mark on Victoria's built environment, shaping its future with a legacy of progress. Welcome, Michaela.
Thanks, Allison.
We've also got Andrew Maynard, who's a director and architect from Austin Maynard Architects. He began Austin Maynard Architects in 2002, and they are focused on creating sustainable, cost-effective, and community-focused housing as both developer and architect, resulting in several awards, including Design's prestigious Architecture Studio of the Year award. Congratulations for that, and welcome, Andrew.
Having us.
Excellent. So we'll kick off today with a question for each of our panelists to take a first run at. And we'll open it by saying, what is medium density housing? Why is it best suited to Melbourne? What is the consumer appetite for medium density housing? And what does affordable mean in the context of medium density housing? So I'll come to you first, Pat, for your response to that quite open-ended question.
Yeah, okay, thanks, Allison. So I suppose we consider medium density housing housing that is up to 4 stories and less. So it includes flat buildings, sort of contemporary walk-up form of those, but we also consider terraces and townhouses in that category, I think. And one of the things that I think is quite important is to contemplate how we get infill typologies that are Torrens title as well as strata title. There is that preference, I think, amongst the cohort of buyers or households for a garden, for a street address, not having to deal with a body corporate. So that's a consideration in the spectrum of medium density housing. Melbourne is suited to medium density. I mean, I suppose it's relatively flat, the regular block patterns in the middle suburbs that make that sort of infill have some potential. There's good infrastructure and suburban amenities which we can build on, which also is evident in the work that you've done, Allison. And I think there is an appetite for mid-scale living. People are willing to make trade-offs. But as to the question of affordability, that becomes the challenge, doesn't it? Because we know that a greenfield house is a cheaper product than typical infill housing, and so in a policy environment where we're aiming for 70% or more of new housing to be medium density in infill context, that represents a really big challenge for government, because we just know that the costs of building medium density housing on a square metre basis are higher in infill areas. So there's a big challenge there to make medium density infill development as friction-free as possible, to keep a lid on those prices as much as possible. So, yeah, big challenge in terms of that comparison between a greenfield detached block, the large house, the garden that offers, versus the sort of thing that you might be able to get in an infill area, recognising also that we need to contemplate affordability in terms of not just the price of the housing, but also the cost of living. And so access to amenities, infrastructure, transport does enable us to perhaps bring those other costs associated with living down. So that needs to be also part of the consideration when we come to a general affordability.
Absolutely. Thanks for that, Pat. And certainly a huge challenge that we also found within our work on Choosing Victoria's Future, when we're really thinking about, can we continue to spread outwards from a greenfield development perspective versus that infill component, and really how that balances out the future economy of Melbourne. I'll turn to you next, maybe Andrew, just to build on what Pat said. What's your view on medium density housing? How might it work best for Melbourne? Any thoughts on affordability?
I've got many thoughts on affordability, which I'm sure we can all talk about at length. We're perfectly placed in Melbourne for some great medium density. We're fundamentally a flat city, which has led to sprawl, which is part of the problem, where we are just not really bound by topography. But because of that flatness, it means we've inherited a legacy of great transport corridors, great train lines that any other city would have put 6 stories of apartments all the way along those transport lines. So we're set up for it. We just have a chaotic planning system that really obstructs that really healthy growth of medium density housing. I know that in the Infrastructure Victoria docs and what Pat just said, that medium density is considered 4 stories. I'd say for any of the lay people out there, just think of your favourite European cities. Just think of Paris or Madrid or Barcelona, where it's 5 or 6 story street walls that are incredibly beautiful. The types of places we pay thousands of dollars to go and visit on a holiday. We are set up perfectly in Melbourne with great infrastructure to achieve that kind of scale and density.
Thanks, Andrew. And certainly we've noted many times in our different reports the opportunities that we have, but certainly that we have such a different style of growth than many of those other cities that you've just mentioned have. I think European cities are good ones to look to. We can also look at a lot of cities in East Asia, of course, as well, and how they've tried to accommodate density. And I think collectively that conversation within Melbourne and within Victoria more broadly about how we want our cities to grow, what is the Melbourne approach to medium density, isn't one that we've necessarily necessarily answered yet. We know how we can accommodate other types of housing, but not necessarily what does the Melbourne approach to that medium density that's really fantastic look like. Michaela, any thoughts from you on that, or the broader question around what is medium density in the Melbourne context?
Yeah, look, I think a couple of thoughts, putting sort of that builder lens on this, on the discussion. I think from a medium density home perspective, like what does good quality look like? It's around that idea of having access to local amenities. It's meeting the 7-star and the livable housing requirements that have come in. It's about building things to a high specification. It's about that balance between meeting consumer needs and their expectations, and really making sure that builds are viable for businesses, because if a build from a feasibility perspective isn't going to stack up, then it's not worth the while, obviously, from a builder or a developer's perspective, for that project to go ahead. I think the other thing is around that idea of appetite. We hear from some of our members who sit there and talk about that they've got consumers out there who want the big block of land to put the big house on. And there's that challenge between the reality of what's existing out there. We know that more blocks that are coming on are actually smaller. So it's how we actually help change consumer mindset around what they potentially want versus what's actually available out in the market. And I think the same sort of situation needs to occur with regards to medium density and making sure that the demands are meeting the requirements from a consumer perspective. And I think the other point around that idea of affordability is, in addition to obviously the cost to build something, I think we also need to look through the lens of a person who's going to live in that house in the longer term. So how do we make sure that house is performing the best way that it can, so therefore somebody's running costs are actually reduced in the longer term?
Yeah, excellent.
Allison, can I just add, I can't let Andrew's comment about a chaotic planning system go by without a response. Look, I think we've got a planning system that obviously needs continual refinement and improvement, and that's, I think, well understood. But I would make the point that we've actually got a legacy of a planning system which is developed for greenfield development. You know, we've done that for 120 years or whatever, since the sort of, mid 20th century, since the car became a big part of our life. So we've geared up and grown our cities, and Melbourne is absolutely the case in point, to sprawl. And you think of the structures and the guidelines and the parameters which we've developed for greenfield housing, and now we've got this infill challenge around medium density, and it will take a long time to get the mechanisms and the planning practices and the government interventions and all of those aspects to set the scene for more infill development. So I think we're just really turning our attention to what a planning system and a development system looks like for medium density housing. That's a project for sure, but I think it's a work in progress.
And Pat, if I just build on that question, so the government's recently introduced housing targets, and that's certainly something that we, as well as PA, have called for in the past. Do you think the housing targets are on track to help achieve that good quality medium density housing? Is that, from a planning perspective, is that a useful and helpful tool?
Yeah, look, in and of themselves, the targets mean sort of nothing in a sense until they're operationalised. So we do see, the Planning Institute sees that targets are important as a guideline for local government to focus its work on strategic planning, to make sure there's good capacity for growth, and that so that there's fat in the system, if you like, to make sure that those opportunities are there. But it's just a starting point. So in terms of the planning response, we need to think about the types of housing within those targets, so whether it's medium density or lower density or detached housing, obviously in some context still. So I know that shaping SEQ, the Queensland Government's plan for South East Queensland, is challenging councils now with targets for different housing types. So it's not just a number of dwellings, it's actually saying, well, low rise, medium density and high rise in some contexts. So, that's part of an elaboration that's required. And then, of course, the targets themselves aren't sufficient in themselves in terms of we need to also think about the amenities and infrastructure that will need to be provided for that housing. So we think about, in our position paper that we put out on housing targets, we talk about the idea of the carrying capacity of an area. So that's the sort of bottom-up capability of an area to accommodate development. And we also think there's, and back to my other point, in terms of setting up what we expect infill development to do, and it picks up a bit on Michaela's point, is what are the minimum parameters that we want to come with medium density housing? And again, in another position paper we've just released in the last week on livable precincts and targets, we talk about the starting point of thinking about reduced car reliance, a minimum contribution to social and affordable housing, a minimum access to open space, and walkable streets and a green canopy. And we think we need those sort of measures as absolutely measurable outcomes so that we know that we're doing good quality housing, rather than maybe the more motherhoody aspects. And maybe that's Andrew's point about a chaotic planning system. How do you embed actual outcomes that we all desire into medium density as it rolls out? So I think the targets are a great start. I've got questions about the scale of those targets and how they're applied, but targets are a good thing to direct planning, but they're just a start.
Excellent. Thanks, Pat. And maybe if we pull back, we've got our first audience question, which I think extends on some of what you said. It's not just about the housing, not just about the housing targets. We have to look at existing infrastructure. And Michaela, you spoke about, needing to make sure that the environment is right for builders as well. Question from the audience came through. ABS data indicate that medium to higher residential density construction peaked in Melbourne in about 2016. Why has it fallen, and what can we do to get it higher? Any perspectives that you have on that, Michaela?
Look, I think we need to look at the cost to build at the moment. That's a huge factor. And as I mentioned before, if a project's not feasible and the costs are too great, then they're not going to get out of the ground. We know we're having challenges with skills and labour supply, so that increases costs. Then we've also seen the cost with regards to raw materials, etc. They've increased exponentially over the last number of years. So purely from that cost perspective, that is definitely impacting those builds from that side of things. Also, I think it's also around consumer confidence and also what people want out in the market. So if product isn't selling, then you've got to sit there and say, do you continue to build that? So the market is probably also being determined by need in that sense.
Yeah, and that's a really interesting one that we covered a little bit in our home choices, right? We did the survey of 6,000 people where we're trying to understand, why people are making the choices that they're making, and people like the product that's being produced in a lot of greenfield areas. It's certainly quite positive around that experience. But then the challenges of not having existing infrastructure start to bite after a while. People become car dependent because there's no public transport. They have to drive, much farther away to get their children to childcare or to school, as an example, and then are restricted in what jobs they can take as a result of that. So it's a really interesting kind of mix of how do you provide something that people find meets their needs and is suitable, and to Pat's point, making good use of existing places and existing infrastructure, while at the same time recognizing those preferences. We've got a question that's come through, and maybe Andrew, I'll throw this one to you. If people want a choice of housing, which includes both medium and high density as well as standalone homes, how do we reconcile the plans or the housing targets, which are helping to articulate kind of more medium and high density living in areas that are traditionally lower density, where they've chosen to live that way traditionally in those areas? How do we get that kind of balance of design from where we are now with the existing way that we've grown in Melbourne to this kind of future where we have more people living in established areas closer to that existing infrastructure? How do we bridge that gap through a design perspective?
Yeah, it is the how. We obviously have plenty of single residential freestanding homes at the moment. The delivery of medium density housing, similar to what Pat said, we can incorporate so much of what people look for in that freestanding home, access to green space and shared spaces and parks. So all of that amenity can come, and we can provide a diversity of product as well, which I think is really important in each building as well, that you can have different price points. The challenge is how do we increase density sensitively? And I would say that the planning scheme itself, because it's a bit of a Frankenstein in between, you've got BADS on one side, which really deals with the internal amenity of apartments, and then you've got res code and sort of this legacy of the code that's written for single residential. You end up with sort of this clash of there's no clear-cut way of actually delivering that medium density. And then we have these vague terms such as visual bulk and neighbourhood character and recessive. And when we end up with VCAT, it gets argued by not designers, but actually by lawyers on what those things mean. So all of that vague language means that there isn't a clear way of executing it. It increases risks for builders and developers, and that probably plays to Michaela's point, which is that's one of the reasons we're not seeing a lot of these buildings built, is because you have to go through this lengthy appeals process, typically, which adds cost, usually reduces the amount of yield that you've got in a project. So we've got all these permits that are just unfeasible at the moment. The how, though, I think that there is too much sensitivity or too much bias in res code towards protecting an individual's right to sit naked sunbathing in their backyard at the expense of the entire generation's access to reasonable quality housing. So we need to get some of the triggers that protect individual housing rights and actually make it easier to build something of scale. I will agree, though, with any critic that there's probably most of the examples of medium density housing built side by side with single residential is typically not sensitive at all. They're really spaceships that have just been dropped into place. And that's something in our practice we work really hard with, is how do we transition that increasing density in sensitive areas.
Allison, can I add to that one?
Yes.
Yeah, so what Andrew's really talking about there is that we need to transition from lot by lot development to a precinct-based approach, so we can think about the overshadowing, a relationship between buildings, where the public open space is. So again, I'm going to reinforce the point I made before. We need to build the toolkit for good quality medium density development, and that we don't have those tools at the moment to think about integrated precinct based development. So we are sort of stuck with the lot by lot contest, which Andrew is sort of pointing out in a way. I mean, a developer might get 2 sites, they might get 3, they might be patient and get 4, and then they can do a good development. But generally, the infill development we've seen tends to be lot by lot, and we can all picture that stuff in middle Melbourne. And as Andrew says, it sometimes leaves undesirable outcomes with, very bulky 4 villa units along the length of the block, all looking down into the detached house that's hanging on next door. So this challenge of precinct-based development is a really big one. And I see the elephant in the room here, which is that we do need greater government intervention to actually tackle that. And so there's a land assembly question which is just not being talked about enough, I think. And there's a shyness of government. They've got big ambitions around housing targets and around housing delivery and infill. But the biggest tool we're going to get, or we've got to address that, is coherent land assembly. And we need government to use the powers that it's got already to actually intervene in places. And that's a huge conversation for the community. I acknowledge that. But the aspirations that we're after in terms of good quality development needs the likes of Development Victoria, Suburban Rail Loop, to actually use the powers that it has at its disposal to actually get the land assembly and the integrated precinct development that will give us those more sensitive and mixed-use outcomes.
Thanks for that, Pat. And that's obviously quite a controversial thing that you've just called attention to, this big elephant, but certainly, and we'll dig into that a little bit more. Andrew, you mentioned things like BADS. Again, for anyone who's on the screen that isn't aware. That's the Better Apartment Design Standards, and how those link in with Res Code and with our VPPs, the Victorian Planning Provisions, is something that's obviously very alive within the planning community of how those pieces, and the design community and the building community, in terms of how those things work effectively. I think it might be worthwhile just spending a little bit of time just digging into what you've just raised, Pat, around land assembly, because I think there's certainly, and we certainly have heard it at different times within consultations that we've done, that there's this concern that once you start to assemble multiple parcels of land that are adjacent to each other, that gives you the opportunity, and that you're going to build something really big, which to some degree sounds like the opposite of what you were saying before, Andrew, in terms of that sensitive design of buildings that don't significantly overshadow. So maybe if we can each touch on what is the advantage of having multiple parcels that are adjacent to each other in terms of actually having that medium density, and you spoke, Andrew, as well, to diversity, which I think is another important piece that we pick up here, to getting that diversity of outcomes that delivers good kind of substantial portions of medium density within a broader low density neighborhood. So maybe, Andrew, I'll give you the first go at that one, but I imagine everyone's going to have a kind of this one.
Well, I think this really goes to Patrick's point about defining precincts. If we simply leave it the way that it is, and it becomes the question of how many parcels can you get to take pressure, so you can get some density in the middle of that parcel to then sort of deal with the lower scale to either side. That's the status quo that we're in at the moment. If we actually, I completely agree with Patrick, we look at precincts or even like strips of land, like look at the rail corridor and say along that corridor, we are changing that planning code. It is going to be 4 stories straight up along there. Then immediately you are taking away the risk that, somebody will, and we've seen it through Brunswick as well, where once you change that legislation, the property prices go up. People are happy to, which is great, a win for them. They sell on to developers to consolidate land, and the building that's behind me, that's a product of that type of thinking. Changing legislation to allow 6-story buildings to go up. You consolidate that area next to a rail line, and council comes on board and buy some of the sites to create a park to the north of it. So you have a precinct vision rather than going down to individual houses or individual lots. And so it's a different lens to look at. Like myself and my good friend Kevin Huey just ran a tour all through Northern Europe only a couple of months ago looking at medium density housing. And it's a very different lens where instead of doing what we do, which is look at this object that's been designed for this site and say, is that object appropriate? Instead, they say, what are the edge conditions of that? And has it reinforced the good of the public realm, or has it been to the detriment of the public realm? And once you do that, once you actually change the conversation away from the object and what is it doing to are we making great public places next to those buildings, it makes the whole process easier, and you're having a more important conversation as well.
Allison, so in terms of, should we fear bulk or scale if there's multiple sites assembled? The best we could do now on a lot by lot basis, and Andrew might have an opinion on this, but I would have thought is a traditional suburban block of say 400 to 500 square metres. At best you're going to get 4 dwellings, unless it's really tall. So you've got that, the constraint of that single lot. So you're talking about 4 dwellings for the one it replaces, a detached dwelling. But if you've got multiple sites, then of course you can vary the density across the site. You can integrate the open space, and overall you should do much better than 4 dwellings for 4 to 1, if you like, in terms of the yield that you might get. So, but that's not possible, or the mix of density and the range isn't possible until you've got a reasonable assemblage of sites and a group of sites to start thinking about. Well, at one end of that assembled site, nearer the shops, you might be looking at 8 to 10 stories. But you'll have a grade of densities down as you're moving away from that centre or that activity area to maybe terrace housing, at the end of it. So I think it's just the flexibility as well that you get in terms of a mix of possibilities when you start assembling sites and thinking about it on a precinct basis. So.
I think, Allison, just one other thing to add to that discussion, I think, is around also industry's capacity to be able to build and deliver these. So at the moment, what we have is we've got the commercial end of the industry who is used to building, your tall buildings, but then at the flip side, we've got down the other end is a large portion of the market that's used to doing residential. And so the part of the industry in the middle isn't as well developed with regards to some of these, we'll call it 4 to 10 story buildings. That portion of the market still is quite small. So the other thing we need to be considering is how do we upskill and make sure that we've got the industry ready to build these types of precincts at scale and at volume to meet the needs moving forward.
And Michaela,
and Allison, just look, absolutely, Michaela's made a great point. I mean, when we hit our peak of 2016-17 yields in Victoria, that was high-rise development. It was centre city focused, and so we've now got this different challenge of hitting those sort of annual rates of development with a greater mix of products. So there is a industry capacity issue which I think deserves some attention that Michaela's highlighted.
Yeah. And Michaela, is there anything else from your perspective that isn't currently being done that would give those kinds of incentives, those carrots and sticks for land consolidation that would help to make that difference to really helping get more people or more companies into that space?
Oh, look, I think challenges with regards to the cost of land potentially makes it some of these projects unfeasible. Also looking at things like windfall gains tax and the implications that potentially can have, because that can sometimes be a disincentive for some of these infill projects. So I think it's looking at some of those sorts of levers to work out how do you make that project stack up so that we can have that greater density.
Yeah, that's interesting.
We're seeing, Michaela, we're seeing a lot of our single residential builders that we work with, there's a real keenness to actually try and scale up into some bigger housing. And one project that we finished not long ago called Slate House, which is in Brighton, that's in a really sensitive single story area with a significant individually significant heritage home next door. And we managed to put 14 homes on a block there that most people think is just one rich guy's house. But that was really interesting because it was a traditionally single residential builder that came on board, and we simply designed the building using the way that they build. So, a stud frame building, and then obviously with much more onus on separation of structure and insulation to scale up and sneak in 14 homes, but actually using, standard single res stud frame construction. So I think there's a willingness there from builders to get involved.
I think, Andrew, it's an interesting scenario that you've spoken about, because we sit here and hear the challenges that industry is facing with regards to there are a number of builders within the industry off the back of COVID who sat there and went, actually, do you know what I'm going to do right now is I'm going to decide where is my sweet spot in the market. So in the past, they might have been striving to be the biggest or have a particular turnover, deliver X number of homes per year. And then off the back of COVID, they've gone, actually, we're more profitable if we play right here. And that might actually be less homes that they're delivering. But part of the challenge with that then becomes from when you decide now you actually want to regrow your business or step into a new market, as you've spoken about, is now the financial institutions and from an insurance perspective, actually getting the buy-in from some of those parties to now actually regrow your business or enter into a new market is some of the challenges that the industry is facing to try and achieve that. So what we don't want to end up seeing is what we've seen with cladding and some of the findings, with regards to waterproofing and situations like that, where you've got people who are stepping up and potentially operating in an environment where they potentially don't have the skills for it. So there is a real opportunity, I think, for industry to upskill. And obviously in your scenario, you're talking about a willingness from another part of the industry to actually be designing based upon where that skill set is at. So I think it's an interesting approach that you've taken.
Yeah. It's also an interesting example of a few questions that have come through about the challenges of being sympathetic to heritage areas is obviously really relevant, but also challenges. And of course, we're not just talking in this discussion about only Middle Melbourne, right? This kind of challenge applies to many different areas. And again, not just Melbourne, but also some of our regional cities that are trying to avoid the same kinds of challenges that we currently have. And, we've seen Geelong and Ballarat, for example, spreading much more rapidly actually than Melbourne did, but going down certainly some of the same, or starting to experience some of the same challenges. So the questions that are coming through from the audience are things like, how can we, potentially look at existing buildings and the opportunity to reuse elements of existing buildings to preserve heritage for new homes? Could we look at more housing around universities as a way of helping to additionally increase infrastructure, or increase capacity for universities that are bringing in more international students, and to help with underutilized land in those areas? What are some of the other ideas that we might need to think about incorporating around heritage, reusing existing land, and really thinking differently about the way that we build in the future?
So just a thought, Alison, on the land issue, and it was pointed out, Michaela made the correct point about the cost of raw land. And so again, thinking about some of those agencies, whether it's the state-owned land, whether it's faith-based organisations that have underutilised land, whether it's the universities potentially that you've mentioned. Some innovation around how the land's paid for is, I think, part of the story there, because the upfront cost may be something which we could think about, changing and still having a return on the land, but maybe it's over time so that it doesn't represent such a great big barrier. So again, I think some creative thinking around bringing some of that land into play in ways that makes the build more affordable is part of the mix here that we're talking about. And certainly there is plenty of that type of land, and there are actually willing organisations like the churches who are interested in that sort of approach.
Excellent. Michaela.
I think, Alison, touching on that point around sort of retrofitting and using existing buildings, etc., some of that challenge actually lies in looking at certain requirements. So NCC requirements for some of those older buildings, how is that going to play out? Looking at things like fire and earthquake requirements, all of these things potentially add cost. So I think this is a challenge between reusing what is existing versus obviously a knockdown rebuild scenario and bringing something new to market. But I think from a sustainability perspective, the more advances that can be made in that space and looking at ways that we can reuse things from a site and putting that back into the project will obviously also help to bring down some of that cost.
Yeah, we've got a question from the audience. Oh, sorry, Andrew, did you want to jump in on that one?
Well, yeah, I totally agree. Like, the most sustainable building is the building you already have. There's embodied carbon in that building, and you can come and knock it down and replace it with an 8-star, incredible building, but you've got it sort of a carbon debt of 50 years you've got to pay back for it. That's sort of the simplistic view of it. But exactly as Michaela said, if you try to just change the class of building, and we've looked at, it's been looked at in the CBD, can we get these office buildings and change them to a different class? And suddenly the fire regs and also access to natural light means that it's completely unfeasible. The other thing too, with a lot of the sort of the many thousands of Victorian, single res homes that are all carefully protected under heritage, is, people come to us all the time and say, can you make this as sustainable as possible? And the reality is you end up stripping the whole thing away until you've just got the brick, and you're basically building a new building behind that, and you're suddenly shooting yourself in the foot in terms of affordability, because it's a lot more labour intensive to go and then re-insulate, re-glaze, re-roof that heritage building. And, I think that's something that we have to have a serious look at, is is heritage. My first job was for Richard Allen, a great heritage architect, and he was really advocated for really vigorous, energetic use of heritage places, not kit gloves, so that you drag that heritage into the current age. And I think we're living in a time now where heritage legislation has been weaponised to actually stop a lot of development, typically by the NIMBYs, and we end up with one sort of lens of what heritage is. So the Victorian is what we see, what we go and protect everywhere else, all through the suburbs, and that is sort of stopping any discussion about introducing medium density where people want to live and near the infrastructure that we've all talked about earlier as well. I think there's a really big discussion that needs to happen there, and we need to stop being conservative and stop weaponising heritage to get these outcomes happening. And we do that by being really creative with heritage places rather than conservative with heritage places.
And there are some fascinating examples, aren't there, from overseas of how cities like Delhi, which is a 7,000-year-old city, have incorporated heritage as they've evolved, as well as many, again, East Asian, European, North American cities, as they've continued to challenge some of these. Right, heritage is not an issue that's unique to Victoria, of course, and it's important that we preserve our heritage while at the same time having that view to the future. It's a really excellent point, Andrew. Thank you. You've also just picked up there on something that I would like to explore further, which is around, you talked about carbon debt of buildings and embodied carbon. We've also done some work recently on decarbonizing infrastructure and starting to think about those kinds of concepts as we make decisions about infrastructure, and the importance of considering non-build solutions, which is something that we've advocated for a long time, or low build if possible, to try it before we think about new construction. But that point about costs that you've just made on heritage is important. When we think about climate change more broadly and what we need to do to start to accommodate climate change, what are some of the options that we have available to us to both incorporate climate change into the way that we're thinking about building this kind of medium density future, but also very specifically to start thinking about our carbon impact that we have within the building industry and how we can do better at incorporating carbon neutral solutions into that future. Michaela, maybe we'll start with you for this one.
Look, I think, and this might be controversial for the architects, but actually getting the builder involved earlier in the build can actually have quite positive impacts here, because they can help with the discussion around buildability. So, and getting that early engagement can be key, and it can also help with regards to identifying solutions that may actually be at a different cost point as well. I think the other thing is around looking at things like ensuring the building design optimises the site. So considering the orientation, comments that Andrew made before around light and things like that, that's really critical to it. I think it's also around the use of materials. So depending upon how things are designed up front, you can get better use and less wastage from materials as well. And making sure at the end of the day that it's something consumers actually want to live in. I think it is really, really critical here. And, we touched on it before about that idea of making sure that whilst there might be additional costs at the outset for a consumer, over the long run, they're going to have a better home to live in, which is going to be less costly to run.
Andrew, is that controversial?
I totally agree. No, I totally agree with you that the earlier, but I've also developed like that building that's behind me. So it's the kind of, as well as designing it. I totally agree. Buildability is something that that needs to be considered right at the earliest part of the design stage, and the discussions with builders and tradespeople and suppliers needs to be really early. Parklife, the building in that photograph, is a 9.1 star. Some people call it the most sustainable building in Australia, and it is completely thermally separated. Concrete plate and column, and then we've used this great insulated panel on the outside to get complete thermal separation through it. That came not from an aesthetic choice, not from me being the artist and waving my pen, but actually going, what are the problems here? Because at the end of the day, architects are problem solvers. So how do we get great affordability and great thermal performance and great sustainability and zero carbon in operation and fossil fuel free? We go and have a talk to the people that are producing the materials and that are building materials. And as Michaela said earlier, the prices on supply and demand, they shift so quickly. You need to have sort of up-to-date knowledge of what materials are available and what trades are available when. And that's where we get these successful projects, is because we don't go and just draw something on paper and then put it out to tender and say somebody build it. The moment you do that is the moment you get left out of the value management equation, which will happen on all medium density projects. There will be discussion about how do we pull money out of it, and if the author of the building isn't involved through that conversation, then we're going to end up with we have ended up with so many subpar medium density buildings. People walking around going, why does that look so cheap? Well, it happened because the original thinking didn't include deep conversations with the people that are building it.
Yeah.
Alison, I'll just talk more generally. The Victorian government's fairly recently changed the legislation which requires the planning system to actually consider net zero in terms of the emissions target, and also a more resilient, urban environment. So that's actually a requirement now in the planning system. And so something that the Planning Institute's called for is a more comprehensive state response in terms of up-to-date mapping of where hazards are, flooding in particular and inundation in particular. And there's been some work done in the bushfire space, but perhaps less relevant to infill and medium density housing, but certainly the flood and inundation. We've seen some recent, stories about the Yarra local government area and flooding potential in Fitzroy and places like that, where we hadn't contemplated that before. So there is a big task there for the planning system to come up to speed, but particularly a state-led response, because we're just relying on council by council responses to actually update planning schemes and update the mapping. Then we'll have a patchwork of approaches, and we'll have some councils reticent to make a call about where places shouldn't intensify. So we have called for a greater state response to actually have a view on where development should occur, where it shouldn't, and what the standards would be, or the minimum threshold standards in those sort of places. So there's a role from a planning point of view, as well as all the great things Michaela and Andrew have mentioned around specific building responses.
Yeah, which potentially takes us back to some of that housing target discussion that we started off with, right? In terms of making sure that the housing targets take account of the future expectations that we have of more frequent and extreme weather patterns as a result of climate change, and ensuring that we don't inadvertently expose construction in the future to greater hazards than what it's been, than what it traditionally has been.
I think the other thing too, the elephant in the room here as well, is we're talking about climate resilience and affordability in the same conversation, and it often gets laid at the feet of the building industry. Like, how do we build more affordably? Well, the reality is a really resilient, future-proofed building that can be here for generations is not going to be a cheap building to produce. We need to look at affordability differently. I saw a great quote just this morning from Jonathan O'Brien, the chairman of YIMBY, that says housing affordability should be measured in rents, not in prices, which I think is really true. Like, if we want to solve the climate crisis, 40% of our carbon is produced from the built environment. That means that what we should be asking of our building industry is build more resilient, more sustainable buildings. You can't have that and also ask us to build affordable buildings, because in a cost of living crisis, an affordable building is a cheap building. And a cheap building will get knocked down in 15 years. It'll require constant maintenance. It'll leak like a sieve. Michaela said that earlier, like its performance will be terrible. So your ongoing running costs are out of control. So there's no ongoing affordability. So I think it's really difficult to ask the building industry to try and achieve both. And what we really need to do is concentrate on building climate resilient building stock for future generation, And I completely agree with Jonathan, like really look at affordability in terms of rents, because the most vulnerable, that's what they're not worried about. They're not thinking about buying a home. They're worried about paying the rent and having some money left over for essentials.
Michaela, did you want to pick up on that one?
I was just agreeing. I've heard that analogy used elsewhere, that I think this is the challenge. And I know when we hear consumers going to talk to builders and saying that they want to potentially do a renovation or a build, and as soon as you're hit with the prices and looking at what you can afford, you start to naturally take back on things. And I think it's the more the conversation is had, thinking of that longer term view around, well, okay, it might be more in your pocket now, but in the longer run, you might actually be better off. It's changing that mindset for people, and it's potentially changing the conversation around, well, okay, if we're to include that in the build now, what's something that you could delay and do later when you've got greater capacity to spend more? But I think the challenge, whilst from that rental perspective, we've got so much stock on the market that isn't up to the standards that we're trying to build to today, that challenge is going to exist for renters for a while.
Allison, I was just going to say, what we're hinting at here is a financing challenge, isn't it? We've got separated, the finance sector, the business sector, the household, so there's something about the joined up nature of this that we need to start tracking as well, so that we can maybe avoid the upfront cost but pay off over time, given that we're going to have lower running costs, in the future. So there's a really interesting challenge there about the financing plus the build integration and the ongoing living costs.
Yeah, absolutely, Patrick. Very astute observation. The other one I was going to just ask Michaela was one that came through a bit earlier from the audience around what role we see for prefabricated builders to assist with fast-tracking medium-density housing, which kind of goes to a few of those different points, right? We've, in some of the work that we've done, so prefab or modular builds can potentially be more efficient during the building process, but picking up on what you said, Andrew, to some degree, the carbon intensity of those sometimes isn't as efficient as building on site. Any views about prefab or the potential for that sector?
Yeah, look, I think it's a great question, and it's one that, when we talk about the housing targets in particular, we see modular and prefab playing a significant role in getting us as a state to reach those aspirational tasks, the targets of 80,000 homes. But I think the thing we also need to consider about is modular and prefab. It's not just simply that, a house is built in a factory and it's dropped on site. We can be looking at actually parts and kits, pieces of a home that are actually brought to site. So yes, it can quicken up the process, whether it's a bathroom pod or a wall system. These are all prefabrication ideas that the industry has come up with. As I said, it doesn't have to be whole of house. But the challenge that we have at the moment is around the regulations. So the regulations aren't up to speed with where the industry is heading in this space. So there's still barriers there that need to be unlocked. We've also got the challenge with regards to insurance and financing. So who owns some of these products at particular points in time, because it doesn't follow the stereotypical build. So there's a few barriers that need to be unlocked for that modular and prefab to really take off. And I think for that side of the industry, for them, it's about volume. So once again, we need to change consumer mindset around what is prefabrication and modular housing, and that it's actually not of less quality than something that is actually built on site. So there's a few pieces in that, I think.
Absolutely. Thanks for that, Michaela. We're coming quickly to the end of our session today, which has gone incredibly rapidly. Just wanted to remind everyone that is watching online, if you could please fill in the poll before you close out from the meeting in a few minutes. And if there's any future topics that you'd like us to make sure that we cover at Infrastructure Victoria in our future webinars, please feel free to let us know there as well. We'll got time for a couple more questions. I'll ask this one now, which there's been a chat or some discussions in the questions around the need for solutions now. So for each of you, and I'll come to you first, Pat, what is the one thing that you would want to be done now to support increased quality, affordable, medium density housing in areas close to infrastructure? What's the one thing, if you could have your wish list?
I'm going to go back to what I said before, Alison. I think we need to, just like we're willing to intervene in the land market for major infrastructure projects, we see that as essential for city building. I think we need to have the same mindset for quality, precinct, integrated, mixed use and medium density outcomes. So I would be thinking that we need to start on that land assembly question, and that essentially does mean a greater role for Development Victoria or a new entity or whatever to be active in the market to create a pipeline of development potential for medium density housing, assembling sites and creating precinct possibilities.
Excellent one. Thanks, Pat. Andrew, what's on your wish list?
Wish list. There's no quick fix, is the answer. This is 40 years of poor housing policy that's playing out and it's come crashing and burning now. So there's no quick fix to this. But what I would like to see straight away is precincts, as Patrick said, and DDOs that get rid of some of these setbacks, these crazy street wall setbacks that cost a fortune, and these words discretionary get thrown around that just extend the planning process. Planning, the risk around it and the cost around it is phenomenally expensive. Take away those street wall setbacks and we can start to increase the form factor so the builders are much happier and they can cost it a much more efficient structure as well. And we can start to get building instead of debating about whether a setback's appropriate or not.
Yeah.
The other one would be get rid of third-party appeals, which I know is happening, which is great.
And DDOs, for those of you who might not know, so talking about design overlay, how we actually, good design.
Awesome.
Very much, Michaela?
I was going to say, Allison, I don't think you can sit on one. I think it's one of those things. There are so many things that need to occur at the same time, and I think from the housing statement perspective, it's come in at a perfect time, and it's starting to unlock a number of barriers. We know pieces with the planning. Regulations are being changed. We know we're looking at reviews with the Domestic Building Contracts Act, which that's going to be critical. We know we've got challenges with regards to labour and skills to be able to deliver this. And then also I think that financing and consumer confidence piece. So as I said, I'm going to sit on the fence. I can't go with one. I think there's a few pieces of the puzzle that all need to come together at the one time to really unlock some of this. And to Andrew's point, this is 40 years in the making, so it's not going to happen overnight, but there's a lot of triggers that need to be unlocked.
Yeah, and a lot of little things that we can start doing to get things moving in the right direction. This has been a really, I just wanted to thank all of our panelists. I've really enjoyed moderating the discussion today. I think we've had some really controversial topics, some elephants thrown out into the discussion today. And hopefully that's given a really balanced perspective from the planning, the design, the build kind of view about some of the challenges that are shared and some that are different in terms of how each of us plays a role in trying to get those policy settings, planning settings, all the design overlays, appeals, and then the building settings right to be able to really achieve what we need to be able to really get a fantastic Victorian version of medium density rolled out extensively to really meet some of our challenges that we have in the housing area going forward. In the last couple of minutes, I would encourage anyone online who has a further interest in some of what we discussed today. Again, all of our reports are online. Many of the reports have been referenced today as well by our panelists are also available on their respective sites. So you can have a look into some of the design that that Austin Maynard architects have done as well, and that Andrew has spoken to, and that Michaela has spoken to as well. So hopefully that has given you some good ideas about how we can help to solve the challenges ahead. Again, if you haven't filled out the poll yet, please do so before you sign off. And just thank you again to all of our panelists. Really appreciate the discussion today.